and the politics of intervention in Afghanistan. As you can imagine, the role of the woman is foremost in our minds. In the background, we're thinking about what's been happening in Iran, but the issues in Afghanistan must be to the forefront of our mind. My name is Alison Scott Bowman. I'm a professor at SOAS, University of London. I'm speaking to you from the 4th floor. It's pitch dark outside, but I know I'm in Bloomsbury because it was bright when I came in this morning. I want to very quickly introduce our brilliant panel, and then I will hand over to Dr. Althea Maria Rivas to chair the evening, and then I'll just come back at the end to say goodbye and thank you so much. The first speaker I'm on my list is Nargis Nihan. She is the former Afghan Minister of Mines and Petroleum, who left Afghanistan in 2021 when the Taliban took over. She's also the founder of Equality for Peace and Development, which seeks to build the capacity of Afghan women and youth in tackling the challenges of development, peace building, and the democratic processes of Afghanistan. We also are very honoured to have here this evening Baroness Fiona Hodgson of Arbinger. She is a Conservative Life peer. She's currently the co-chair of the APPG for Women, Peace and Security, which seeks to reinforce the government's commitment to women's and girls' rights in countries affected by conflict. Through her APPG, she has also sought to put a spotlight on the current situation of women in Afghanistan. Just before I go on to Dr. Nazir Andishah, if I could say a little bit about APPGs, because we've also set one up at SOAS. APPG stands for All Party Parliamentary Group. This is a quasi-governmental meeting point. It doesn't have the status of a select committee, but it allows us to have meetings in Parliament, and indeed Fiona chaired a meeting today on this very topic, which I'm sure she'll talk about later. The one we've set up at SOAS is about communities of inquiry, bringing together young people, academics, experts across the board to influence policy by discussing really urgent issues like this with parliamentarians. So there are different ways of having an APPG. Fiona's one is Women, Peace and Security. Ours is a general one about bringing together experts and parliamentarians. That was a little bit a quick plug. It's called SOAS ICOP, and that was a little bit of plug for our work. Next, Dr. Nazir Andishah. Very honoured to have you here with us this evening. He is Afghanistan's ambassador to the UN in Geneva and former Afghan Deputy Foreign Minister of Management and Resources. Dr. Andishah continues to examine the UN's role in relation to Afghan women. He is also an academic with research interests including regional security and governance in South and Central Asia. Welcome. Next, we have Seema Ghani, human rights activist and former chair of Hand in Hand, an NGO that seeks to encourage women's economic empowerment and decision-making in Afghanistan. Seema formerly served as Deputy Minister at Afghanistan's Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs and co-founded several business councils for women in Afghanistan. Finally, last but not least, our key linchpin for this evening, Dr. Althea Maria Rivas is Senior Lecturer at SOAS in Global Development, Peace and Conflict in the Department of Development Studies. Her research has involved extensive field work in the politics of development, conflict, humanitarian intervention and peace, with a focus on Central Asia, West and East Africa. Althea is the author of Security, Development and Violence in Afghanistan, Everyday Stories for Intervention, that was published in 2020. And in on 12th of November 2021, in lockdown, Althea attended with Nargis a panel that we ran, it was all online because of lockdown, with Professor Noam Chomsky, who is now 92, but he was amazing. And we can let you have the link to that event, which was very successful. And Althea and Nargis were the stars there, of course, with obviously Noam Chomsky was the real star, but he was very understated and very elderly, and it was a fantastic session. So Althea, may I hand over to you now, please, as chair or moderator for this evening's session? Thank you.
Of course. Thanks, Alison. I just want to check everyone can hear me. Yep. Great. Okay. So firstly, I'd like to thank Alison, Sanjana, Rana, Hassan, and the rest of the ICOX team for inviting us here tonight and for all of the hard work that they've put into making this event happen. As an academic that's worked and or lived in Afghanistan for the last 17 years, I'm acutely aware of the need to keep the issues that we're going to discuss tonight at the top of the international agenda, and really to not repeat the mistakes of the past where international disengagement with Afghanistan led to, I think, disastrous consequences for many Afghans, particularly for Afghan women and girls. So it's events like tonight that will help us continue to stress the urgency of the situation to a global audience, which is imperative. So tonight we have, as Alison said, a wonderful panel of experts that will share their experiences, their knowledge, and their insights on the gendered realities of intervention in Afghanistan and the kind of post-intervention phase right now, if we want to call it that, specifically focusing on the everyday realities of Afghan women and also of local and civil society and somewhat international efforts to address the current situation. So each of our panelists will speak for approximately 12 to 15 minutes. And then time permitting, I'll give a short reflection on their comments and provide an opportunity for the panelists to respond to each other if they would like. And after that, we'll move to a question and answer session. Audience members are encouraged to write their questions in the chat box as the speakers are talking, so we don't forget anything, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of thoughts and reflections from the audience as well. The questions will be collected by Sanjana and Rana throughout the presentations, and then the panelists will have an opportunity to respond to the questions during the Q&A round. So without further delay, I'd like to get started, and I'd like to begin with Nargis. And then after Nargis is finished, we'll hear from Baroness Hodgson, and then Dr. Adisha, and finally, Dr. Ghani. So Nargis, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening and good morning and good afternoon to all the participants from wherever they're coming online. Thank Alison, Althea, Sanjana, Rana, and all the organizers for putting today's event together and for continuing to support in amplifying the voice of Afghan women. I also have to thank my fellow panel members, Madam Hodgson, Ambassador Andesha, and Sima Ghani for attending today's event. I will provide a very short information perspective about what we saw post 2002 in terms of intervention of the international community and the politics of the engagement with regard to human rights and women's rights in Afghanistan. I'll also provide short information perspective on what happened after 15 August in Afghanistan. And at the end, I'll also present few recommendations that I have based on the consultation that I always have with my sisters inside Afghanistan. Well, as we all know very well that after the incident of the 9/11, the US and allies made it very clear that they're going to Afghanistan to liberate Afghan women. And to be honest with you, when they came to Afghanistan, they did provide a lot of support for Afghan women. Hundreds of millions of dollars were allocated for different projects to support women, capacity building, empowerment, whether we are talking in the public sector, in the private sector, in the civil society, in the media, in all the sectors that helped us out. And also we came with different legislations to make sure that Afghan women are empowered and they are taking part and participating in different affairs of the country. But despite all these progress that we're making and having women as members of parliament, as members of the cabinet, as serving as advisors, deputy ministers, and different institutions, the reality of the fact was also that our participation was seen more as participants that we had to mostly focus on like technical activities and social activities. But when it comes to actual politics, when it was coming to negotiation and discussion about political affairs of Afghanistan, once again, Afghan women were being consulted, but we were never heard and we were never part of any important political decisions which were made with regard to Afghanistan. I'll give the example of the peace process. When the United States decided in 2018 to start the peace process, you can go online and check all the statements that Afghan women through different platforms issued. And we kept on warning the international community that the Taliban has not changed. The Taliban do not, do not uphold the promises that you're making in Doha. And on top of that, we also kept on talking about establishment of a monitoring mechanism to make sure that we're holding Taliban to account for the promises that they are making. While they arranged different platforms, events, and conferences, they invited all the women, and our participation was very colorful. But end of the day, they continued with the peace process. They signed the peace deal, and we saw what happened to Afghanistan after that. Unfortunately, all the fears that we had, the Afghan women, all of them came through, and actually worse than that is beginning to come through in case of Afghanistan. After 15 August, like after the whole evacuation, what we saw that we were expecting that the international community would be very hard on the Taliban, that why you entered Kabul, why you did not give into a political settlement, even if the president had run away. We had others in the country, we had other political groups and factions that we could have an immediate meeting, and we could have an interim government to be able to uphold everything rather than closing down everything. But then despite of that, what we saw that every one of them began to engage with the Taliban. They went to Kabul. They began to take pictures with the Taliban, posting and promoting them in social media, which was good for their own personal career, but it was not helping the situation in Afghanistan. It was boosting the confidence of the Taliban that, okay, we took Afghanistan back by power, and we are here, we have the victory, and the world has no choice but to engage with us. And what happened that they took the people of Afghanistan, the 40 million people, as hostage. We also saw that they began to apply restrictions on the Afghan woman. And what we see right now, that Afghan women are literally restricted from each and everything. So it was highly frustrating when you talk to Afghan women, because we feel betrayed by our allies, because while Afghan women are taking all the risks, they're going on the streets and protesting for their right, we see our allies that still they go and they use very soft tone when they're talking to the Taliban. And then they are telling us that what do we do so the Taliban could take us seriously and could listen to us? Well, you already exhausted all the leverage tools that you had in place by not working consistently and united in terms of your engagement with Taliban. You have not empowered Afghan women enough so that they could have performed better. And that is the situation that we see. And things have already worsened for Afghan women on the ground. But what we also see, the spillover of the situation on the region. We already see the extremism and terrorism taking roots not only in Afghanistan, but it's also beginning to having its spillover in other countries in the region. But despite all these difficulties that we have, the disappointment that we have with the Office of the United Nations, UNAMA, the way that they're dealing with the Taliban, not putting any pressure with the Taliban, giving $14 million of cash every week with the Taliban. And when we ask them for the accountability, they don't have any information, or they don't want to share anything with us. We also have some spotlights as a silver lining that is giving us hope. And that is, first of all, the young women that they're taking all the risk and they're protesting for their rights inside Afghanistan. We are having many women at the community level that still they are reorganizing themselves. They are taking the community elders with themselves. They are trying to put pressure on the Taliban and hold them to account so that they can resume their activities and they can deliver to the communities. We also have women in exile that they are beginning to organize themselves in different platforms by establishing those platforms on their own and trying to come together and speak and amplify the voice of Afghan women from inside Afghanistan. We have platforms such as Afghan Women Coalition for Change, which is being totally established by Afghan women. We have Afghan Women Advocacy Group, and we have so many other platforms that Afghan women are virtually coming together and are trying to raise their voice. We also have very strong allies, such as Madam Hodgson and many others, that they are regularly holding different meetings and providing us the platform so that we can raise our voice, we can interact with the policymakers, and we can criticize the situation, but also present our recommendation on improving the situation. We also have allies such as SOAS, this project, and many others that they provide us with the platform so that we can raise our voice and we make sure that we continue our struggle and try to stay in the agenda of the international community. We also have, although people are very much critical of the Afghan men, that they're not standing by Afghan women at this very difficult time, especially they are most of the time being compared by men in Iran. But to be very honest to you, situation for Afghan men and women inside the country is very different. It cannot be compared with Iran, because Taliban are much more brutal and harsh when it comes to Afghan men in terms of like torturing, abducting, and even killing them in comparison to women. That's why in the beginning they tried to support Afghan women protesters, but when most of them disappeared and they were tortured and killed, that created a fear that they could not join. But through social platform and many mediums that they have, they're continuously standing by our side and they're supporting us. The best example is Ambassador Andesha, that he is tirelessly working and engaging with the United Nations and constantly reminding them about the situation of human rights in Afghanistan and holding the members to account through different avenues and platforms. So these are the silver linings. In terms of the engagement of the international community with Afghanistan, what the government has done and are doing is really disappointing. But we have many allies within the parliament, within the civil society, within the feminist group that they're continuously working with Afghan women and they're trying to provide us with a platform so that we can raise our voice. The situation in conclusion, if I say, is frustrating, especially when we see that the attention that Ukraine got after the changes. We understand, I remember I talked to so many allies and they were telling me that, oh, your president ran away and the president of Ukraine didn't run away. That's why people are appreciative of that and they're supporting it. Yes, our president ran away, but women didn't run away. Many of them stayed inside Afghanistan. They're going on the street, they're taking life-threatening risks, and they're protesting for their rights. Isn't it unfair that we are overseeing and we're not supporting them just because the president has run away? Same thing goes with our sisters in Iran. We are proud of them, what they are doing. But let's remember, the struggle that we're having inside Afghanistan is way different and much more difficult than our sisters in Iran. They are asking for their rights to have freedom of movement. In case of Afghanistan, we have to fight for basic rights such as education and work, where actually they are already having those rights. You cannot compare what Taliban are doing to Afghan women groups in terms of
I think, Nargis, we're having a bit of a problem with the connection.
My recommendation for you are not Taliban. What can we do? Am I back? Atia, am I back?
Yes, you came back, so please go ahead.
Okay. So just the last point that I want to make, continuation of provision of platform for Afghan women so that Afghan women can raise their voice, Afghan women can present their recommendation. And most importantly, time has come after 15 months of trying to change Taliban, trying to convince Taliban to uphold and respect the rights of women, trying to convince Taliban to form an inclusive government. The time has come that we come together and begin to explore that what could be our plan B for Afghanistan if it's not working. What can we do about the situation before things get totally out of control? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nargis. It was very powerful and concise as well. So a lot in what you've just said in those last 10 minutes. So I'd like to go to Baroness Hodgson now, Fiona.
Thank you very much. And it's always a pleasure to follow Nargis. And I'm very conscious that I'm the only person on the panel on a very important panel who isn't Afghan. So I am not an expert like the rest of them, but I would say I'm an interested participant who has tried over many years to try and support them in various ways. Afghanistan, when it first came into our perception after 2001, was reputed to be the worst country in the world to be a woman. And I became interested in working on women's rights, particularly internationally. And in 2006 was the first time when I met a group of Afghan women in Washington, and talking to them, I was absolutely appalled to hear about how difficult life was for them. And so to cut a long story short, I started it in, I went to Afghanistan. I decided I wanted to go and talk to women there and to bring back the voices of what was going on to policymakers in the UK. And then in 2012, I set up an Afghan Women's Support Forum. We didn't have any funding, we still don't, it's going 10 years later, but it brings together people who were working on Afghanistan, whether they were Afghan or people who worked in some of the NGOs, people who were interested, people doing different things, journalists. The Foreign Office here now helps me run it and brings voices in and projects in. As Professor Scott Bowman also said, I co-chair and run the all-party parliamentary group on women, peace and security. And as she has already talked about, there are many APPGs, and we particularly focus on the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security that highlight the disproportionate effect that conflict has on women and girls, and also the essential role that they can play in peace building, conflict prevention, and post-conflict reconstruction around the world. We run a whole series of events focusing on different countries and themes and looking at the UK implementation there. And Nargis very kindly was a speaker this afternoon. We were running an event on how the Taliban takeover was impacting women on the ground. I've also, in this regard, I've been a member of the steering board of the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative since it was launched by William Hague and Angelina Jolie. And there again, things like forced marriage, child marriage is really part of sexual violence in conflict or post-conflict. And I have also been working with the Nargis and others on trying to help them come together, which has launched the Afghan Women's Coalition for Change. And I'm very pleased about that, because any interventions and what we do from here on in, it has to be Afghan led. We have to go with what the Afghan women want and help them facilitate it. And I do feel passionately about that. We're here to support, we're not here to lead. We can sometimes point to things that have happened in other countries or give ideas, but at the end of the day, this is the Afghan women's campaign, and we have to support them. So, I mean, coming to the gender element, I think we've heard from Nargis about how little rights women had in 2001 and how the international community poured money and projects in to try and support women in Afghanistan. And I have to say, I really admire the Afghan women. You know, even when I first visited in 2011, it wasn't easy there for women. A lot of the men can be very hostile sometimes. There are some lovely men there who support women, but it's hostile. And I think all the women that came forward to take their place in public life were outstandingly brave. You know, it's never easy being a woman in politics. There's still no country in the world where there's true equality. Even here in the UK, we're still fighting to get more women into parliament. But there, I don't worry every morning when I come in that I'm going to be shot at on my way to work. And you may be attacked by colleagues sometimes in the political world. But I mean, the Afghan women have been outstandingly brave, all those who came forward to take their part in public life. And I really salute them. I think I agree with what Nargis said about the negotiations in Doha as the Americans talked about withdrawing. I mean, it was awful, like watching a car crash happen, frankly, because once the Taliban knew that the Western forces were leaving, I think there was that statement, wasn't it, where they said the US has the watches and we have the time. There was no incentive for the Taliban to come forward to negotiate because they knew they just had to sit it out. And the one good thing was 4 women were sent as part of the negotiators from Afghanistan, which often in countries there are no women sent to peace talks. And they were 4 utterly outstanding women. But it wasn't enough. And the way the peace negotiations were constructed, there were various committees, and it ended up often with one woman on a committee. Well, I think any of us in public life know when you're one woman on a committee, you're usually having an incredibly hard time and you don't always get support. And then, of course, August last year, we all watched with horror at what happened, absolute horror, and the Taliban takeover. And of course, you know, all the women who come forward to play their part in public life, you know, most of them knew that their lives were in danger. And, you know, those of us who'd been in touch with people, it was harrowing hearing these phone calls, or people whose relatives were stuck trying to get them out. I mean, it was absolutely terrifying. So we are where we are, which is Nargis has laid out, and obviously, you know, knows much more about what's happening on the ground than I do. But I think it's terribly important that we do listen and we do understand what people are going through there. And I always think of I have a friend here who runs a widows organization, and for women-headed households, the situation must be torturous and terrifying every day in a lot of places. And of course, I'm sure it's not even across the country in different places or different ethnic groups. It's even worse. But generally, the situation is uncertain and unpredictable and frightening, I should think, to be there. So I see that you wanted to talk about intervention in it also. And obviously, you know, we had 20 years or so of military intervention and diplomatic intervention there. And looking forwards, I don't see the West militarily intervening again, certainly not as things stand. I think, you know, always when there's you know, we managed that the West had helped with training the Afghan army, training the Afghan police. But as we saw, once the West withdrew, you know, it was work in progress. It probably needed another 10 years to become strong enough to really hold the ground with all the logistic support. I think the Americans were helping in various ways. And once that was withdrawn, it was very, very hard to hold the ground. So where are we now? Yes, well, it's, you know, I think one of the things is that Afghanistan for many years has been reliant on aid and help from outside. And no doubt the Taliban will find it difficult to run the country without getting some kind of help. So that has to be a lever to encourage them on governance and proper law and order, not just law of the gun. I think the other thing that is always in the back of my mind is that ISIL are lurking in there. So, you know, if the Taliban were to completely disappear, you know, I question what would happen. You know, might we get something worse? And that isn't a remark meaning that we should accept the Taliban in the way that they want to govern, or they're governing as now, because we have seen in a year the rights for women just be completely erased there. There's no women in public life. There's many places girls can't go to school, stop going to parks, can't go out on their own. I mean, none of that is acceptable. So how can we intervene? Well, I think obviously the international community, the Taliban do still, I understand, have an office in Doha. We have to come together to try and influence with whatever levers we have. There's also work being done at the UN. The UK and others had set up a group of friends of the women of Afghanistan. I think that's a very good group that we should be leaning on to make sure that the UN continues to lobby about you know, the women's rights and having proper governance and accountability there. In the UK, we are about to launch a women and girls strategy, which, you know, I hope will also focus on Afghanistan in part. And we need to ensure that that we focus on that. And we have a new national action plan on 1325. And I hope that Afghanistan, I'm sure, will continue to be a focus country for that. So I would like to kind of pose a question. are we clear what we want, what we would all like to see happen in Afghanistan? Because I think if we could decide what we would like to happen, we could then start to think about how could we make it happen? And I know that sounds like pie in the sky right now, but I always think it's good to have in one's mind, where would we like to go to? And what would we like to do? Because no country is going to be either peaceful or prosperous with half its population excluded and shut back in home. And we need to all get behind, as I've said, the Afghan women. It's their campaign. We need to support them. And I hope that with time, we can help to make some changes there, because right now it's really a terrible situation and incredibly disappointing for all of us who've worked for many years on Afghanistan. So I will stop there. And thank you all so much for inviting me today. I feel very honored to be on this panel.
Thank you, Fiona. And now we'll go to Dr. Andisha.
Yes, thank you very much. I have to change my spot because I have one of these terrible lights which saves, the electricity, and it switches off. So I have to come directly under it to keep it on. First of all, I would like to, thank the organizers of this event and my co-panelists. I think this is a very significant topic as far as Afghanistan is concerned, but also, internationally. And I think this is an area of, let's say, a segue back to Afghanistan from the international community's point of view, because I understand that past 20 years, Afghanistan, was called many things, including the longest war of United States and things like this. There was a fatigue, donor fatigue, and all the kind of fatigues that you might think. But I think one area which perhaps is a common interest, because people were in Afghanistan, the international community was in Afghanistan, particularly the militaries, because of a common threat, not a common interest. And once that threat shifted to different places like, Syria or Iraq or somewhere else, also the attention shift. But we always emphasize on common interest. And I think the issue of human rights and women's rights, particularly of women and girls, is an area of common interest. And I'm glad that the world is kind of, reconverging on this issue. I would rather have the name of this the panel. Of course, it's now sort of post-mortem, and instead of the politics of intervention, as the politics of withdrawal. But anyway, so it's perhaps that's the topic that we're talking about. We're not talking about right now the consequence of intervention, which has this negative side, but all in all had a many positive aspect. And one of this is that we are sitting here and talking about women's rights. So I've been given the job of talking about the UN, what UN is doing and what UN can do, particularly from Geneva, where is the seat of UN human rights and humanitarian action. And this is where Afghanistan is. Afghanistan is back on the square one, where humanitarian and human rights is I think the top agenda. I just came from a briefing by Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths, who is in charge of the humanitarian affairs. And he was talking about the landscape and projections of humanitarian affairs around the world. And I think one topic which he focused, and of course I had also a number of questions for him, was Afghanistan, and how protection and access is increasingly becoming difficult in Afghanistan. While a year ago, most of the UN agencies were bragging about the access and that they have. Now they're increasingly feeling that access is becoming more and more difficult, and particularly access to vulnerable population like women and girls. Access to geography is different from access to population in need. So, but then what is UN doing? And I think, when it comes to Afghanistan at this stage, the only major player left on the ground is the UN. The expectations are very high from the UN, and we all know that the UN is what the member states want it to be. When it comes to the mandates, I think UN has perhaps one of the most robust mandates. The UN office in Afghanistan, UNAMA, a mandate was renewed in March of this year, 2022, and it's very clear mandate if the UN or UNAMA can do it. But besides, what UNAMA is doing or not doing, we understand their limitations, and we understand that, as I said, that they are the reflection of the politics of Security Council. But my focus is mostly on here in Geneva, and I think Geneva is perhaps when it comes to Afghanistan punching above its weight when it comes to the global politics, especially in areas where the interests of the P5 are not, converging. And Afghanistan, unfortunately, in a number of years since 2018, lost that P5 consensus. I mean, of course, after 2014, Crimea annexation, but mostly, after this the terrible peace talks that, Nargis also alluded to. So, but what's the situation in Afghanistan is that, when it comes to women and girls, lack of rights is becoming a government policy. So that's a systematic right now, women, discrimination against women is systematic. And that's what we are here in Geneva talking about, gender apartheid. Because if you put the gender, you put apartheid together, it's a clear case of gender apartheid there. Protection for women and girls, for everyone, but particularly for women and girls, is almost zero. We see these cases of girls and women protesters being arrested, imprisoned, tortured. But the only thing the UN is doing is what also the rest of the NGOs are doing, just sending a tweet saying that please release this or that. I think poverty is another serious issue, especially for women and girls. And I was just, as I said in this humanitarian briefing, it's that they are the most vulnerable because it's very difficult to reach to this population. For them, it's difficult to access this aid. And since there are very few, if at all, women humanitarian workers, particularly from within the country, so this access to women is difficult. So again, women are the most vulnerable. Right to education, I don't need to mention that. You all know about it. It's a serious thing, and it's a systematic discrimination. So UN in Geneva basically moved much quicker than the other parts of the UN system. We had a resolution last year on which created the Office of Special Rapporteur. I think the only major UN interlocutors, UN system interlocutor when it comes to the protection and promotion of rights is Mr. Richard Bennett. I mean, he's doing a good job given the resources and given the mandate that he has. His mandate was further reinforced this year. But one particular point that I see is that the world is, again, as I say, this converging around this issue of women and girls, is that in 1st of July this year, there was an urgent debate on the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan. And I think this is unprecedented. And it's because the former High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, when she returned from Afghanistan, she, in one of her speeches, which I think if that was the highlight of the speech, and she said that the situation of women in Afghanistan is worse than anywhere on this planet Earth. So I think that draw the attention, and that's what somewhat we were able in Geneva with the help of all our women activists who again use Geneva's platform to raise the voice, because I don't represent Kabul, but I represent all these women and girls and the people of Afghanistan all together who does not have a voice. So they become voice, they came to the Human Rights Council and they raised their voice, and in this urgent debate, these women and girls, they participated. And because of that, I can see that, somehow this issue of women and girls slowly breaking, those barriers of like-minded group, global South, global North, things like this. I think when it comes to the issue of women, there is some level of convergence, but of course, still there is politics of this issue there. But our colleagues, some of women here, like Minister Nehan was there, Madam Kofi, Barakzai, and a few others were all there who basically went also and they saw the OIC ambassadors. Like, for example, Ambassador Qatar, who is a lady, UAE #2, Malaysia, Indonesia, just to tell them that, look, we are not asking for something, out of the blue, but we are requesting basic fundamental rights of women of Afghanistan, girls of Afghanistan, commensurating to the women rights in Indonesia, Malaysia, just all of these Islamic countries. So Taliban cannot use this pretext of Islam to suppress women. So I think there's two cases to me, looking at from Geneva's point of view. And to be honest, and I can confess that, now most of my diplomacy here is feminist diplomacy, woman diplomacy. I think this is what I'm working at. Perhaps, one of those men that I can confess that we made big mistakes, we men, we spoiled everything in Afghanistan, and now it's a woman who are, sitting in the driver's seat to regain and to get back to at least fundamental rights of everyone in Afghanistan. And that's what the Taliban are facing, a very strong group in Afghanistan, a society, a group, a tribe, the biggest one, which is the women of Afghanistan. So there is of course a tragedy, a disappointment, but also at the same time there is a positive news. The tragedy is that how the women of Afghanistan were abandoned last year. Myself as this same generation who was educated, trained, and slowly moved into the ladders of Afghanistan Foreign Office was very disappointed, and I went even to depression, thinking that the women of Afghanistan faced what they faced under a democratic administration in the United States, where Kamala Harris was the vice president, where Madam Clinton was one of the architects, and where Samantha Power, was the head of USAID. And they was, when they were asked, what is your responsibility? They said zero responsibility vis-a-vis. I mean, that was shattering all our, convictions and everything for some sort of, value-based politics. But anyways, this is how you are when you're depressed. So you go down to denial, depression, and you come back slowly, and we are coming back. But again,
Dr. Adisha, I don't want to interrupt. I just want to let you know that you have 2 more minutes to wrap up.
2 more minutes. Yeah, I have one more point, which I'm coming to the good news. I'm so for giving you the tragic news. But the good news is that it's actually the women and girls of Afghanistan who were the first, that in the second day of Taliban's arrival, they stood for their rights. They went to the streets and they demanded. And I see that, of course, the other countries are coming slowly around this case. Like, I'm very glad that we have Baroness Fiona here, and she is mentioning that the UK is coming forward with their own policy and strategy, and the Afghan Women Coalition is based in London. But the good news is that now it's becoming more of a very endogenous movement of the Afghan women. It's, after all these failures, after all this defeat, so they are coming back. The seeds are germinating. It's just, you can see that is becoming, a group of women. They're coming together and they are taking the lead. And the question that you asked, that what can you do, is, I think, if our partners, they can stay course, they can keep pushing for the values that they desire for themselves and for their women and for their girls. Same for women in Afghanistan, and keep pushing on the agendas, which is international agendas, but staying behind these women who are now taking the baton and leading this struggle for restoration of rights in Afghanistan. And we do too. I think there are a large number of men in Afghanistan which they believe that we have to stand behind our women in this struggle. And with this, I thank you very much.
So, thank you, Dr. Andisha. And then finally over to Dr. Seema Ghani.
Hi, everybody. I don't know what time it is in your countries, but at least it's 11:15 at night in Kabul. And as Andisha was talking about his light, I'm actually sitting in a solar light. There is no power tonight. It's been very interesting to listen to all the other friends, and also thank you very much for organizing this discussion. I was asked if I could concentrate on how do women in Afghanistan currently navigate on this, very small, limited space that they have, and how things have changed. Let me remind the younger generation that probably did not know enough about the past of Afghanistan. We had a parliament in the 60s. We were ahead of a lot of the Western countries in voting rights. Our constitution allowed Afghan women to vote, although we never had the opportunity to practice it because the government was a different type of government. We had ministers in the cabinet until 1992. That includes during the communist regime, of course, senior leadership and all that. It was all there. You've probably seen all those in the pictures. If you Google Afghan women in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you will see how women had their freedom at the time and managed to politically participate, then social and economically as well. I'm not saying that we had perfect governments. We had a lot of issues, but at least women had, the ones that were in the cities and wanted to go out and not cover up, then they could do that. They had the freedom. There was a choice of what you wear and what you want to do and how you educate yourself or your daughters and your sisters. Since 92, the takeover of Mujahideen, which happened with the help of the international community. There is, Fiona mentioned that, and the West is not going to get involved in supporting any military actions in Afghanistan. When Afghanistan was responsible at the time in the eyes of the West to take down Russia, they did help. Billions and billions of dollars poured into the country. Mujahideen started their actions and they managed to basically, okay, we did not, I'm not saying that Afghanistan defeated Russia, but it was part of it. Of course, there were other issues in that, but other hands as well. But it was the West that helped us with our weapons and setting up this strong Mujahideen groups in the 92 when they came and took over. And then women had to cover up. And from that time, things slowly changed for women. They used to go to school, but you didn't have the freedom of, deciding what I wear and how I go to school. With Taliban, in a few years later, it got worse, of course, as we all remember. The 20 glorious or golden years that, again, international community came, the 49 different countries to support us. There was a lot of achievements. Let's not see the intervention of the international community in the country as a failure. We did make a lot of mistakes, as Nargis John also mentioned earlier. Presence of women or participation of women in a lot of places was symbolic. But it actually taught us a lot of things. It taught women how to get up and how to fall, but then also stand on your feet. Coming back now, since August, what happened in August was not something that Afghans facilitated. There was definitely international community that had a big part in it. It was a decision made internationally. It was for 2,500 soldiers of American forces to stay behind, or shall we just, leave and then leave 36 million population behind and give them as hostage to Taliban, to a regime that the West decided to talk to, but not ensure that they implement everything that they had agreed on. Before the implementation of the Doha Agreement, the international community decided to leave. So that wasn't something that Afghan women had a decision on or a hand on, or I suppose a lot of Afghan men or the youth or younger generation. What we see today, of course, is a result of that decision in 2021. Girls cannot go to school, of course, only until the age of 11, 12, sort of an early teens, they can go to school. Older than that, they cannot go. Coming back to the question of how do they navigate, their space, the teenagers. When I was at school at their age, this was a communist regime time, we used to hold demonstrations. We were able to be active within the school, outside the school, also university time. Today, they don't have that space. They're not able to do that, unfortunately. The minute they stand on the street, they are beaten, they're imprisoned, they're tortured. At times, they just disappear. There are some women and men that have been imprisoned for months and they've disappeared. Nobody knows where they are and what happened to them. The UN is not pushing. I'm going to probably, you know, just bring in a few points that I heard earlier. It's the job of the UN and the international NGOs and others that are looking into amnesty and human rights and all that to be pushing the Taliban government and asking where these people are. Just tweets, as it was said earlier, is not enough to tell Taliban, release this and that person. There has to be real pressures that such imprisonment should not be allowed at all. Girls do not have that space. When I see young women here in the country, I see them all depressed and majority with mental difficulties and mental health issues. And there's nothing they can do. They've lost hope. They don't know what to do. They look at us, people like us that are coming and going because I go back and forth between Afghanistan and the UK, and they feel that maybe we are able to do something, and yet we don't have any hope to give them because we don't know. As Fiona said, we've heard this so many times from the Western world that there will not be any military engagement, and then by the discussions that Nigel Casey and others are holding at talks that they're holding in Doha, we don't see any results. Nothing has happened. Nothing has changed. Women's rights have been taken hostage by Taliban. They're using that really strategically against the international community. They keep pushing and pushing. So we've come to a stage where we've been even released, or the West has released part of the funding, the reserve fund that was frozen. They've released that. Every week or every month, funds are going through the Central Bank of Afghanistan to the UN agencies to be spent in the country. So that means we've actually, or the international community has taken a lot of the sanctions, they've removed a lot of sanctions. Taliban are able to travel to a lot of places. They, you know, freely travel to regional countries. I mean, Turkey is not region, I suppose, very close to Europe. They're easily going there. And many other places. But girls are not able to travel because, you know, they have to have a mahram with them. They're held at the airport if they're traveling without a mahram. This is, of course, these are sort of, you know, things that are completely new to us, to all of them. I feel like Afghan women have been left alone. I feel that, you know, the way the international community stood with Ukraine, they didn't stand with Afghan women. And the reasons, whatever reasons are given, I do not believe, you know, you can justify that. We need the civil society in the West to push their governments to support, to pressurize Taliban government, the de facto authority. The one that's not even a government, they're all acting ministers. People haven't actually seen the top leader who's claiming to be the leader of the entire Muslim world. He is the Amir al-Mu'mineen. Nobody's actually seen him. What kind of a government is that? There is no recognition of it by the people of the country, let alone, of course, internationally. What we need is the West to stand with us, not just by supporting us, by talking with us, by standing within our marches, by writing things, but pushing the politicians in their countries to have direct talks with Taliban. I really don't want what we did in 2001 to repeat. It might be controversial what I'm going to say to a lot of our friends, including Afghan or international friends. I was in Bonn in 2001, not the political meeting, but there was also a civil society meeting at the same time. And Zalmay Khalilzad and Brahim and all those that were involved in the political discussions used to come and report to us and also ask our opinion. We advised, a large majority of us advised, to make sure Taliban are part of that government, that they had to be given seats in the new government. America opposed it completely. Nobody else. Okay, some of the Mujahideen teams as well, but mainly America because of what? Because of the September attacks, because of what they did in America. They did not want that. We should not be repeating the same mistake now, assuming that somehow this government or this authority is going to disappear and we're going to create something new. We should also not make the mistake of assuming that by talking to them, just by talking to them, without pressurizing them, without the sanctions, they're going to change anything. Have they changed anything since last year, 15 months? No. They've closed parks on women last week. That's new. Of course, you know, they had closed everything else. The rumors are that they might be again holding young women hostage, and next year in the spring, they might be also shutting down universities on girls. So that's another thing on international community. They just want less sanctions and more freedom for themselves. While we're giving a lot to them, we're not actually taking back and asking anything back. On what dearest Fiona said about, you know, what should we do? I really think that UN can take a more active position. The Security Council cannot just make a statement and request Taliban to do this or not to do that. There has to be more pressure, more political pressure, more sanctions. And you also know, everybody knows that our politicians are outside the country. In the region, in other countries, they're all forming different groups. We have to start bringing them together to talk, to create an alternative or create a government where Taliban are part of it. But it has to be a new government created. What Taliban have set up, this is not a government, this is not acceptable by men or women in this country. At smaller level, I think continuously, you know, supporting the civil society, particularly the local civil society, is very important. We need to make sure that they continue flourish, you know, these years. They've lost a year of their life, they cannot study, they cannot work, but there are home schools, for example. There are groups of young women gathering together and discussing things. I've seen they have libraries, they have groups that like chat groups they have. We have to try to see if we can strengthen them. We need to also, something that last week I was also advising in the UN, is localize the funding situation, the funding from the donor community. That means make it slightly easier for the local small NGOs to be able to access the funds. Because now funds are not coming to the country. If they're coming, they come through the UN and then the INGOs, the international NGOs. Nothing reaches the really grassroots that actually need that support, because we can't evacuate everybody. We have to make sure that they have a home and life in here. Women have the strength to continue, and of course, you know, get them out of depression if possible by keeping them busy, giving them opportunities to do things. But basically, you know, I think we need to pressurize Taliban, pressurize our governments in the West to pressurize Taliban to agree to a new government or a proper government. This is not a government. I think we have to start from really high up. I really don't think opening schools is the answer. Schools under this sort of an authority will not result in anything. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Ghani, and thank you for staying up so late to be with us tonight. There are a lot of questions. We can't see them all in the chat. So what I'm going to do is ask 2 rounds of 5 questions, and we'll perhaps have 1 response to each question, okay? But I'll ask the questions and then the panelists can respond to whichever question they would like, okay? So the first question from the audience is there a danger in singling out women's rights and not addressing it within the human rights kind of framework, more broadly speaking? Okay. Secondly, what can be said of the media coverage, I guess in the UK or in the global north, of the present situation, right? So we have seen very stereotyped, I guess, images of Afghan women that were very similar to the ones we saw in 9/11, right? That really hasn't changed. And then we have a question for Nargis, I guess. So Nargis mentioned Iran, and while the situation with Afghanistan and Iran is very different, is there a possibility, because there is also, there are a lot of Afghans in Iran, right? So is there a possibility of solidarity or some sort of a transnational or regional feminism, so where you support each other in both of these difficult situations? Then we have another question about technology. So how much access do women have to technology and the internet? And would they be able to use this work or engage in other activities if they were squeezed out of the public space? Okay, so I'll just repeat those again. So is there a danger in singling out women's rights and not addressing it within the human rights work and human rights framework more broadly speaking? What can be said of the media coverage of the present situation? What are the possibilities of solidarity between Afghan and Iranian women right now? And how much access do Afghan women have to technology and the internet? And is this a possible way in which they can engage in advocacy work? What are the possibilities of, or what are the consequences of them being squeezed out of the public space? Okay, so maybe we can start with the first question. So is there a danger of singling out Afghan women's rights as opposed to talking about human rights more generally speaking? Okay, Dr. Adisha, yeah.
Yeah, so just because we're doing a lot of this here in Geneva, I think it's a valid question to kind of to separate it and they shouldn't be. But when it comes to the situation of Afghanistan, and especially after August 15 last year, the grouping of countries here which work with the Human Rights Council, and this is where the decision about the human rights activities are taken, have been sort of traditionally divided between countries which we call like-minded, mostly China and Russia and lots of others, where they focus on the economic and cultural rights. They are talking that this is very important. And then the others are mostly focusing on civil and political rights. So it's any area which falls in one or the other, it creates a division. And that's why when it comes to, again, to these resolutions, we shouldn't have lots of abstention, because otherwise it doesn't work. So I think the issue of women and girls, particularly in Afghanistan, is a cross-cutting theme between these two division of human rights diplomacy. So I think it's very difficult for anyone to say that, look, the women rights in Afghanistan, to politicize it. Although unfortunately in the past there has been cases where the Chinese and the Pakistanis and few others were trying to put the context of separation of women rights in Afghanistan in context of culture. That this is it's a kind of a cultural desire of the Afghans or the Taliban, or representing the true representative of the culture of Afghanistan. I think it didn't work, basically. So that's why I think, yeah, there is that danger. But just as an entry point, I think the women's rights is a point of convergence, and we see this also between the OIC, the Islamic countries, and also European Union. So this is, I think, an area that we are all working to bring it together. But one point also particular to Afghanistan and to the Taliban's mentality. I think if Taliban accepts women's rights, even the basics of this, they won't be Taliban anymore. So I think we have found the best way or best solution, entry point to them. So that's why it's very important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Adisha. Dr. Ghani, did you want to also say something there? And then we'll move on to the second question about the media.
Thank you. I really am sort of, although I'm a women's rights activist, but I think, we should stand for everybody. I've worked a lot with children, so I support children's rights, particularly the vulnerable groups in the country. But I really believe that we should not just because it's dangerous or not because it's dangerous, that we should not stand only for women's rights, that we should not forget human rights in the country. Women are not the only groups in danger. While we might be seeing more about women and hearing about them because we are in contact with them, because we have these chat groups and WhatsApps and everything else that you can imagine, Twitter and all that, more reports about women because they go out on the streets. What we do not hear about is that every week at least two young men, three, it depends really, it's not sort of a specific figure, are taken and killed because they were either a soldier, an officer, or somehow involved with the previous government. People don't talk about that much. Or, because there are no jobs, they try to escape the country or at least go and find jobs in Iran, or on the border, they're killed by the Iran police. A very close friend of mine lost her son, who managed to get through Iran, but on the border of Turkey, he was killed. So it's young men also lose lives, and we're not actually talking about them. So it's good to stand for women's rights, but I think, let's not forget, just, the whole thing should not be shadowed by this. Just a little touch on the media coverage. No, unfortunately, media is not covering what's happening in Afghanistan. I think even from before, people that were not closely working with Afghanistan didn't actually know what happened in the last 20 years. I mean, I keep repeating myself that, the billions of dollars that came to the country were not wasted. Okay, there was a lot of corruption that I can admit, because that's my field, anti-corruption. But capacity was built. There are thousands and thousands of people that have master degrees, let alone, ordinary degrees. We have PhDs in the country, things that were very, very rare in the past, or at least they had to go to abroad, and you had to belong to a king's family or someone to be able to get a PhD. Today, things are very different. So a lot has been achieved, but that has not reflected in the media. Normally, what people see is BBC and CNN. And these two show what actually sells. It's not their fault, What sells is war, the ugly face of Taliban that were attacking soldiers in the past 20 years. And then today, their face sitting and taking over the palace and walking around on the streets. There is another side to the country, and those pictures are not going out. Unfortunately, part of the media is also having access to the country, are misrepresenting Afghanistan or what's happening here. They show that everything is okay, but let's not forget that access is not security. Just because they're able to walk around or drive around, it doesn't mean that the country is very secure. So I don't know. I mean, I'm answering the question, but I don't have a solution for it, because it has to be really. We need responsible media to be presenting and projecting what is really happening here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Ghani. Fiona, would you like to say a few words? We have a lot of questions, so if I could just ask people to be concise so we can get through, because we have about 7 more questions, and some of them are actually quite important questions that I think you'd like to respond to. Okay. Oh, we can't hear you, Fiona. Oh, Baroness.
Sorry, I'll be very quick. I absolutely agree with Seema about human rights, but I think the issue is that women's rights are human rights, and I think we need to present it in a way that it isn't a Western thing that we're trying to impose, which is why I'm so keen on this being Afghan-led and us supporting. I think when it comes to media coverage, well, the media, they focus on one thing and then they go on to another, and I think it isn't just Afghanistan that they've kind of, we hear very little about what's going on in Iraq, what's going on in Yemen, what's going on in Ethiopia, what's going on in the DRC, what's going on in Syria. I think they kind of, and I think Ukraine took over because in a way it's much closer, and therefore there was a feeling of threat and the nuclear issue and all the rest of it. So I think we don't get good media coverage of many of these many places that are in conflicts. I don't think it's Afghanistan alone, but the spotlight goes on to something else. So I think we do need to hear more news about what's going on. I think would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Baroness. And then Nargis, and then we'll have the next round of questions. And as I said, there's a lot of them, so please be brief if you can, Nargis.
Thank you very much. To add up on what the rest of my colleagues have said about the danger of women's rights and human rights, I have to mention that if Taliban would have implemented only gender apartheid, then we could have focused only on women's rights in Afghanistan. But Taliban are also going on former employees of the government, men and women. The Taliban are also going after other ethnicities, and they're depopulating people from different parts of Afghanistan. There are videos surfacing in media that people are crying because of the starvation, but still Taliban are forcing them that they have to leave their houses, and they're bringing their own soldiers and distributing their houses. And this has nothing to do because of the gender, but it's just because they are depopulating some other minorities. So it's important that we focus on all of them, because it's not only gender apartheid. the gross human rights violation that are happening against other ethnicities and religious minorities is really frustrating in Afghanistan. In terms of media, unfortunately, media is not paying any attention to Afghanistan, and that's where the technology has been very, very helpful. Our impression is that the world wanted to keep quiet and watch the situation and just think and pause on the situation in Afghanistan. But the only reason that we managed to pressure the world and the politician and prevent them from more engagement with the Taliban, or at least even recognizing the Taliban or opening their office back in Afghanistan, is because the girls protested, and with the support of technology and social media, we managed to reflect that, we managed to circulate that. And although the mainstream media decided to keep quiet about it, but it was actually the social media and technology that helped us to spread the news and get the world realized on what is happening, what's happening in Afghanistan. In terms of possibility of solidarity between Afghan women and Iranian women, that is already happening. We are working in different platforms. It's not as powerful as it should be. That's also because we have not worked a lot with Iranian sisters before. They will focus on their activities, we'll focus on our activities, but then suddenly we realized that how much our struggles are resonating with each other, especially when we came with so much similar slogans for our freedom and for our struggle for our rights. And I'm very grateful to many of the Iranian activists, because right now the spotlight is on them. So they are getting more attention, they are getting more platforms, participating and discussing about their struggle in Iran. But they are using each and every opportunity whenever they are provided to also raise the situation of Afghan women and remind the world that Afghan women are also fighting and they're also under pressure. So yes, those solidarity are happening. But I would highly recommend that we actually part of that in terms of expanding women movement and that region within that context, perhaps bringing together and providing more joint platform for Afghan and Iranian women would be really, really helpful, because that actually can also encourage women from other countries such as Iran, such as Pakistan and other countries to come forward and be part of this movement in terms of fighting against extremism in that region.
Thank you very much, Nargis. Okay, so we have another round of questions. So I think I'm going to, again, read out all of the questions, and then the panelists can respond to the ones that they would like to. So the first question I think is for Baroness Hodgson. So saying that the international engagement in Afghanistan should be Afghan-led is not new. Right? So we've been saying this actually for decades, right? We used to talk about Afghanization, local ownership, like these are things that have been part of the international engagement or international intervention. So now at this point, what are international actors and particularly political masters, right, willing to do to change that, really what has been rhetoric for 20 years into practice? Like what are you willing to do differently? Because that needs to change. So that was one question. The second one was, we spoke a lot about humanitarian aid, but humanitarian aid is like a band-aid. And a lot of the issues around poverty, for example, are not going to be addressed by humanitarian aid. So what are the possibilities for having more development aid, or is development aid necessary alongside humanitarian aid? And what does that really mean for Afghanistan? Then we had another question. How have the members of the Taliban responded when women have questioned them? For instance, when they can't enter the parks of Kabul or in gyms. Okay, so how have they responded to the resistance from women's groups? Okay. There's been some reporting about secret schools, particularly by the Washington Post. So is this one of the examples of how women and girls are going to be involved in creating services on an informal basis so that they can continue to participate in public life? Okay. Then the next question is there a feeling on the ground now that people want more intervention or another intervention, I guess, intervention from the international community, or is that viewed as problematic? Okay. And then another question is about the UN. So is the UN really the best interlocutor for the distribution of aid? Has there not been major issues around corruption, for example? And this question actually has a couple of parts. So what can the UN really do if they can actually do something, why haven't they done it as yet? So I guess this is more about, the mistakes that have been made by the international community. And if we're going back to the same actors, really, can we expect something different? Yeah, and when we say that interventions have positive sides, aren't we taking an extremely privileged position? Also, does our ability to discuss these topics kind of outweigh the negative impacts of intervention? Okay, so those are pretty hefty questions. Would you like me to read them again, or
Do you want me to start, Elsia?
Okay, I don't need to read them again. People are ready to respond. Of course, go ahead,
No,
Dr.
yeah.
Ghani.
Thank you,
Please
because
go
I
ahead.
have
Yeah.
my favorite topic, which was humanitarian aid and UN. I actually attended a meeting. I came yesterday morning and attended a meeting at the UN, but it was WFP together with World Bank, and they're actually discussing the setup of some kind of a safety net, like a social protection system in the country. This discussion or study has been going on for a few years. I've been part of some consulting work with some international experts on how to do this, because in Afghanistan we do have poverty, the rate of poverty increasing, but it was already increasing in the past. It's not just as a result of August 21, but things are getting worse since last year. Distribution of wheat and flour and rice is not sufficient. So one thing that's happening is, like some other countries, to cover those that are really vulnerable, such as the women head of household or children head of household, the disabled or physically challenged and elderly and all that. But what about the youth, the younger generation? There are some of the UN agencies and some of the international NGOs with subcontracting local NGOs. They're actually doing economic empowerment, but it's very little. So a real development aid is not going to happen in the country because of the sanctions. And I personally do not recommend it because, as I was saying earlier, I want sanctions on Taliban. Any big funding coming for development projects will have to pass through Taliban, through the ministry, through the banks, with their access, and that should not happen. What we can do is a small level of economic empowerment work in the country. That's already being done to very small standard, but it should just increase. That's possible. As the question of, is the UN the best option for these kind of work? For humanitarian work, yes. For assisting NGOs, INGOs and all that, working with them, civil society, yes, but not politically. UNAMA is not doing its job. I really don't know what the current SRSG is doing, or how active she might be, because she only arrived a few weeks ago. But the previous SRSG, unfortunately, actually, I was living next door to Anas and Sirajuddin Haqqani, and once a week she was there meeting them. I mean, how important is it to meet the heads of Haqqanis all the time? It's kind of almost a one-sided. Then of course the Kandaharis would be upset with her because her relations were with one side. We didn't, and we haven't so far seen any result of any action from what UNAMA has been talking about with the government. So politically, I don't think UN is the right institute, or maybe it's not actually implementing the mandate given to them, which is maybe another thing that politicians, the member states, should do something about. And I think probably Dr. Sebandesha is going to talk about it. But for humanitarian aid, for small development projects, economic empowerment, UN, international NGOs, and local NGOs are the way to go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ghani. Baroness Hodgson, would you like
Thank
to
you.
make some comments? And just a reminder, we only have 10 minutes left. So again,
Okay, I will go quickly.
Thank you.
I probably should caveat all my remarks that, these are my personal views. I'm not actually representing the British government or anything like that, although I'm a member of the Conservative Party. The first question about Afghan-led and being a bit of a platitude. I think that I would probably argue, and others may know much more, that one of the mistakes we made when we went into Afghanistan was we didn't really understand how the country worked or would work or could work. And then that was complicated by various countries taking various pieces that they tried to work on, and then the whole thing didn't really jig together. So I think it's probably why I talk about Afghan-led. I think Afghans know what might work or the ways to make things happen in their country. And I think we didn't listen enough. So that was why I do feel that this needs to be Afghan-led. And also there's more resistance, I think, or more excuse for resistance when they say, well, those are Western ideas. We need to come away from that. Humanitarian aid being a band-aid, yes, of course it is, but things are desperate right now. And, development aid would be much better, but I don't think we have so much opportunity with Afghanistan as it is to deliver development aid and try it. There's been systemic breakdown, as I understand it. Seema and Nargis know much more, and Dr. Andisha, but from where I sit, it looks like the systems are weak in many places, but they're pretty broken right now. And so we've got to stop people starving. That's the most important thing, and get things in until we can actually start to help with more development aid. Is the UN really the best interlocutor for aid and at the moment? Well, the thing that worries me is it's often very expensive. Some of the UN agencies take a big front-end percentage to do it. Is it the best effective way? There are other organizations working on the ground, people like Halo doing demining, who could also probably distribute some humanitarian aid to search for common ground. But I mean, we need to find a way to get money to the local associations on the ground. That's where you can really make the difference. So we need to look at ways that we could do this, and do this so that we aren't, the money is effectively used where it's needed most.
Absolutely. Thank you, Baroness. And then Dr. Arisha or Nargis, would you like to make any comments, or you don't have to, it's up to you, but if you'd like to, please.
I will follow Dr. Andisha.
Okay, if I leave any time for you, just. I think, on this, I will go quickly as surgical as possible. On the secret schools, why not, a massive investment internationally by Google, everybody else, to reach out to all those girls? I mean, why it's happening in Ukraine, not happening in Afghanistan? Why should be secret school? Because there is no more hope. I think the world can come around and we can have massive education online for all the girls. On terms of international intervention, I'm, again, want to be blunt. It's not that if the people of Afghanistan want intervention, even if they want, there won't be any intervention. If it is that if the Taliban make another mistake and then there's a terrorist attack somewhere, there will be an intervention. So the question of responsibility to protect, which is a very UK kind of idea, is that when that to be triggered? Is that something that we should think of after Syria or not? So I think an intervention is not most desirable thing, but if it happens, it will happen again. And then the last question, the impact of intervention. And I saw this question. Of course, there's a lot of merit in this question because the impact of intervention did not reach bottom of society, especially in the places there was war. But then I'll put the rhetorical question again. Impact of intervention as opposed to what? As opposed to 1996, 2001 Taliban's rule, I can defend that, saying that there were 9 million children going to school before August 2015 from 1 million. And then 35% of these were girls. So 3.5 million girls were going to school. 85% of people had access to primary health. And then the number of, the kilometers of road which was built in the country we have never seen in its history. So that woman movement that I was talking about, and I'm still talking about, is actually the product of this. Was it very effective and efficient? Of course not. Is it something that we could, learn and build? Of course, yes. And I think this, I call it opportunity of 20 years. To me, it seems to have germinated the seeds, or at least saw the seeds, in which, the sort of Afghan-led process could really bring, a bottom-up change in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adisha. And finally, Nargis?
I will add up quickly a few more points on what rest of the panels have said. I think looking at the governance structure in Afghanistan is really important. The big gap that we had between the urban and rural had nothing to do because of the modality of the help, but it's because of the structure of the governance that we had. We had a highly over-centralized system in Afghanistan. Everybody knew that if they have to build a career, whether it was in the private sector, whether it was in the public sector or the civil society media, they had to get to the Kabul. They had to get to the big cities. So we have to make sure that we create a structure, a governance structure that's actually focusing more on rural areas rather than urban areas. That will help us a lot moving ahead. And in terms of international aid and development, I do not advise that we need to have a political solution for Afghanistan. Until you don't have a legitimate government, until you don't have a constitutional order in a country, how can you even think of development? No matter how much development aid you provide, there's not going to be any development. In the state, every day we are going backward. So if the world really wants to help Afghanistan with development, the world needs to help us out with a political solution, with having a constitutional order, with having a legitimate government. Then with a little bit of support, we can move ahead ourselves. If you don't have in hand all these things, how can you even think of development? And Afghanistan is going to remain as dependent as it is today, and the people are highly frustrated. You go and talk to women, they keep on telling you that don't turn us into a generation of beggars. We want to be independent. We want to be entrepreneurs. We want to be active. We want to take the part in development of our society. But for that, they need to have that environment. They need to be empowered and enabled and have that environment to do that. And in terms of response of Taliban, unfortunately, like what can you expect from a group like Taliban? So the girls are going and they're not asking for anything. They're asking for their rights to education, to work, and freedom. But then what is happening in response? They're being abducted, they're being tortured, they're being detained by the Taliban, and most of them are forced to disappearance. They've even gone and they've given warning and got signed letters from their family members that we are going to release these girls because of not only the pressure that they have gotten from the international community, but also because of the money that they have gotten from UNAMA for release of those girls. And then they have gotten those letters so that those girls cannot move and do anything. They've also gotten their passport, national ID number, card, everything from them so that they don't leave Afghanistan. That is the kind of response that you're getting from the Taliban in response to the girls that they're going and protesting for their rights. The Afghan people, although the level of awareness is high, but education is low, but people are politically very well aware. And that is our situation that has made us aware of the situation. So the people of Afghanistan, when you talk to them, they will very clearly tell you that the conflict that we have in Afghanistan does not have only domestic dimension. It has its regional dimension and it has its international dimensions. That's when you're talking about the solution, they are looking up at the international community and they are asking for support to be able to address the situation. So yeah, international intervention is welcome, but not the way that it was done in 2002. Because in many, many ways, now and areas, you have Afghans with capacity and capability and leadership that you didn't have it. So please do not empower warlords and like useless politicians that you did last time. There are many people that they are effective, they are educated, they have the expertise, they have a different vision, they are clean, and they want to be part of the solution this time, only if the world wants to engage with them. And the last thing that I want to make about the UN is not an ideal mechanism for any of us. But unfortunately, with the situation that we have in Afghanistan, that is the only mechanism you have. If you're saying that nobody should go to Taliban, then how else we are getting the money to Afghanistan if you don't give them to UN? But then unfortunately, UN somehow know the situation. That's why they are not open to bring changes. They are not open to try to like have more of a consultative process because they know that they are the only mechanism. So I think putting pressure on the UN that they come up with the structure which are more open and consultative for delivery of aid is going to be helpful.
Thank you, Nargis. We only have 2 minutes left. Maybe I'll say just something quickly. So I think all of the speakers today talked about the possibilities of engagement with Afghanistan and really focused on the need to let Afghan women, in particular in these conversations, lead. But ultimately, I think in a broader kind of more global sense, as someone who works on intervention, I mean, the message here is that there has to be another way, right? So the practices and politics of peace building and international intervention, it needs a serious rethink. And if what has happened in Afghanistan has not allowed us to understand that, then I'm not sure what will, right? And if we don't have that rethink now, then we're just going to repeat the mistakes of the past. The hopeful message is that there are many people like our panelists tonight and many others who can assist in helping us do things differently moving forward. So it's just for international actors, donors, academics as well, policymakers, NGOs, to really listen to them. And hopefully the future will look a little bit different. Thank you, Alison. You're muted, Alison.
Thank you so much. Althea, your expertise, Althea, is absolutely crucial here, and we're very grateful for that. It's brilliant to hear these experts this evening. Fiona, also, thank you so much for taking the lead in Westminster on this work. It's really, really important that we can support you in any way that we can. As you've seen this evening, the secretariat that we've got in for ICOP for the APPG was able to make this happen, and I hope that we can have lots more meetings. The situation is dire, and we have to keep pushing to get this publicized. Thank you so much, Althea, for chairing so brilliantly, and thank you everybody on the panel. Please follow us on Twitter at SOAS ICOP, and I hope that you have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to take part.
Thank you.
Bye.